I had this absolute fervent belief that this was the game that was going to liberate young adult women to enjoy themselves, and utterly fundamental to this was their belief in the importance of women's friendship.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news and opinion from arts academics at the University of Auckland.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Julianne Evans tōku ingoa. I'm Julianne Evans. I'm the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts, and today I'm talking to Dr. Margaret Henley, who is a lecturer in communication and who specialises in sports broadcasting and the history of women's sport. Tēnā koe, Margaret. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you. Tēnā koe, Julian.
Now, the project that you are particularly focused on at the moment, which I think is very interesting, is a Marsden-funded project about netball and the significance of that game in this country. It's very significant, particularly for women. And I'm just interested to know how you came about looking at that project and why you found the history of netball in particular so interesting.
Well, the history of actual netball and how it came to New Zealand has always fascinated me, because I was pretty sure that it was wrong, the way that it was written, and as with these things, they just keep getting repeated and repeated because everybody takes it as a truth, and like a creation myth of like one moment there was this game came to New Zealand with one person, and I knew that could never be accurate. So that always was just sort of in the back of my mind. But my first love is actually broadcasting and looking at any media of women playing sport in early media. So that was very early on was film shot on nitrate film and very unstable. And so during my doctoral research, part of my thesis was a historical chapter, so I thought, well, I'll just go through looking at all of these images and see what I can find, and I got very obsessed with the early material because there was very little of it, which there was very little of it for everybody in all sports in New Zealand, but particularly for women's sport, even less. And another issue always is the gendered nature of archives. And so that often the endeavours and sporting endeavours of males are considered to be worth saving, and those of females not worth archiving. And so that's very much been the history of what is there and what is not there in the archives. And I think it's far more interesting as to what has been left out of archives sometimes than what has been put in there. And of course the history of the All Blacks and rugby in New Zealand has dominated that type of history, archival research and preservation. So I started looking and in fact after many years found a film that had been missing for many years, which was filmed in a canister and somebody in netball's garage, in a rusted old canister, still on film, and we had it preserved, and because it smelt of vinegar, and we managed to save 25 minutes of a film shot during the Depression at a netball tournament in 1932. Wow. Which was very exciting. Yeah. There was a few tears shed because it was such a perfect, beautiful thing. And then coming out of that, there was I found some film strips. That was the way that things were taught in schools, post-war particularly. Very static, but film strips were the pretty modern visual technology back then. And then there were already in the archives, there were newsreels, cinema newsreels, and as you may or may not know, New Zealand's cinema was completely dictated by foreign product. In fact, there was 90 to 100% foreign product.
Say from England, would it be mostly?
Oh, America.
America
the films
well.
From America.
Okay, yeah.
Newsreels came from America and from England, but there were these enterprising people around New Zealand who shot their own newsreels, and they, very little resources. They learnt the technology reading trade magazines and things and working it out for themselves. And they went out and filmed local things that were happening and turned it around, had it edited and on the screens that week so that you'd see a short little newsreel.
Was this in the movie theatres?
Yeah.
You could see
that was the only place you could see
course,
it. And that's the only place that New Zealanders could see themselves playing sport, and the only place that New Zealand women could see themselves playing sport. And so that was, I became obsessed. I'd always been obsessed with newsreels, but with these local newsreels. And then, of course, the NFU, the National Film Unit, started filming them. So we had things like the pictorial parades that were actually beautifully made, coming out of Pacific Studios down in Wellington and in Miramar, the home of filmmaking. And those were really beautiful. And so I spent a lot of time looking at those and then trying to find the coverage that there was of women playing what was called basketball. Netball in New Zealand was playing basketball back then. And that was the only way that they could see themselves. And because women in particular, but people didn't travel much, so that being able to move between centres in New Zealand was actually quite difficult and expensive. And then, of course, we had periods of depression and war and rationing and all of that, so they just didn't get to play one another or see one another. So in some little regional areas, they had no idea how the representative level of the game was being played. And so maybe once a year they got to see that on our screens. Yeah. So, yes, that was, one of my obsessions. And so I've spent years actually looking for that type of material. And what we have found that it's not archived necessarily.
Where did you know where to look? I mean, how did you... I'm interested to know how you found that little canister.
We just kept asking questions. I just kept going around and in netball circles saying, look, there was this piece of film shot in 1932, and I have evidence from the minutes, that unpublished minutes in the archives of Netball New Zealand's history, saying that this film went around the country with a projector, because nobody could afford a projector, for 20 years. It went all around, and it went to, Westport and Hokitika and Greymouth and, down to Nightcaps. So that was just travelled the country, and then it disappeared. And because new technology came in, and I just kept on saying, it can't be lost, it just can't be lost. I know it's got to be in an
someone's garage,
in a box under the bed. It's just got to be somewhere. Nobody will have thrown this away. Well, I believed.
Yeah, and you were right.
And we found it. And so that was just asking, putting out the word, putting out the network, saying, if in the boxes of stuff that has come through to you, is there a rusty old film canister? This is what they look like. Yeah. So,
and someone finally said yes.
Yes. They, and it came, via two coaches previous coaches of the Silver Ferns, who had them in a box of stuff that was in the garage of one and moved to the garage of another. No idea what was in there. But of course, there's no archive. There's no central place because, women's sport usually was looked after by, usually a whole pack of school teachers who kept things in boxes, and they moved and
not centralised, just sort of in their own.
Yeah, when they died, that often family didn't know what it all was, and that just didn't go anywhere. So we were just lucky that this was kind of kept together, and it's sort of like the vaguely important box, but goodness knows what's in it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking for, those vaguely important boxes.
And then you went into even more, back in time, didn't you? And you started to look at really early days of people playing the game in this country and people who were the pioneers of it.
Yeah, yes. And because I knew it had to have started, sporadically isolated with people saying, there's a bit of publicity, because there was a lot in the local press about this new game for girls that was sweeping through America and had gone over to England, and it was so. And we had a lot of that syndication of overseas news and newspapers in the early 20th century in New Zealand. I mean, huge coverage. I mean, there wasn't a lot else
to read or do.
well, yes, there was, but that sort of importance of what happens overseas is more important than what happens here, type of thing. So there was a lot of coverage, and I thought, well, there has to be enterprising, usually school teachers, who went, we'll give that a crack. And so I figured that it had to be experimented with. So it was a matter of just trying to find that. So it's a kind of like a detective story, and you just work away at something which leads you to something else, and try to find the documented evidence and try to find the name of somebody that you can actually verify and hopefully triangulate that source takes a while.
Yeah.
But I got there in the end.
You did get there, because it was always assumed, from what I've read, that it was a man who brought the game to this country, and you were quite keen to prove that wasn't the case, weren't you, Margaret?
Yes. He was very instrumental in spreading the game, but he certainly was nowhere near the first. So that was
a reverend, wasn't it?
That was the Reverend Jessie Jamieson in 1906, and it was assumed that he was an Australian, but he wasn't. He was actually a New Zealander, and he married an Australian woman. But he was the travelling secretary for the Presbyterian Church, and his job was basically to proselytise, really, and he travelled right throughout New Zealand regularly, and he was building the Bible class movement for the Presbyterian Church, and as had already come through, part of New Zealand was this, from the YMCA, was that muscular Christianity, which linked, that to keep lives healthy and the mind clear.
I haven't heard that term before, but I like it.
It's well researched and written about.
Yeah.
Was sport and God, sport and Christianity, as this wholesome way of the clear mind, clear body, clear soul. Yeah, and very much for men. And it was also, to have leaders, but also, men who had led with, obviously Christianity is central in their ethical base and ethos. And there was a very strong YWCA movement as well, and they embraced those same ideals, but things got a little bit more, sort of depowered a little bit with the games that they chose to play. But they were still, this new game that came out of the original invention of basketball in 1891, James Naismith in America and Massachusetts, that a women's game of that was very quickly adapted within months of that game. And so that you had this sort of dual development of what is, the big powerhouse now of basketball, indoor basketball, but you had this other form that when it went through these women to England through the YWCA, that became netball. It was called netball, but it wasn't here. It was called basketball. They still kept. So in New Zealand for a long time we had outdoor basketball, which is netball, and indoor. Yeah. So it came through that, and I knew that he couldn't possibly be the first. And he set up, really the first competitions there were in Auckland came out of the St Luke's Church in Remuera, and they played St David's, and there was a regular competition going within a few years. But he organised competitions within the Bible class movement in the Presbyterian Church. So they all, they travelled down to Dunedin and played in Knox College in a competition in 1907.
In their lovely long Edwardian clothes.
Oh yes, they were fully wrapped from
and their weird little hats.
Yeah, little fluffy berets.
Yeah.
But he was the instigator of that idea. But there were women who carried that on, but there were still other pockets before then, actually before the turn of the century, where it was being played. And that's where the redoubtable Jessie Knapp comes into the story.
Right. Do you want to tell us about Jessie?
Love Jessie Knapp.
Yeah.
And she turned out to be more of a wonderful find than I thought. And there was mention in parliamentary papers of this game being played in Wanganui girls in 1898-99, so, and it was called basketball. It was on a
field?
No, it wasn't on a field.
Oh.
It was on asphalt courts because the school inspector noted that there were asphalt courts, and there were actually 60 girls playing the game, and Jessie Knapp organised competition between her day girls and her boarders, because obviously there weren't other schools she could play against, because she was just trying out this new game.
And she was a teacher at the school.
Yes, she was a teacher at the school, and she was absolutely extolled for her efforts by the headmistress in her annual headmistress reports, which are always fully reported in the press.
Isn't that funny to think of that now?
Just imagine reading all of those and the Herald or stuff.
Yeah.
And so it took me a couple of years actually to work out her name, because everybody, particularly researching women, is very difficult, because it's a little easier if they don't marry and change their name completely, but even then it becomes difficult because they take on their husband's initials. So but with school teaching it's even 10 times worse, because she was just called Miss Knapp, and I just couldn't work out, and then I found it was J Knapp, and so it took me a long time, months and months, before I actually worked out who she actually was and got her first name. And then I tracked her all the way back down into Nelson, and found that she'd been born in a little rural area down in out of Nelson, called was it Spring Creek? No, it's not Creek. Can't remember the other bit. And she was born at only a couple of months different from Ernest Rutherford. And in fact, Ernest Rutherford's mother would have taught her. And Jessie Knapp and Ernest Rutherford were the two children from poor households in rural areas that got scholarships to go to the main school, and so they went to Nelson Boys and Nelson Girls. Spring Grove it was in Nelson. And so she was a very bright little button, at that time, against the odds, coming from a very poor rural family. And so both of them got supported to go to school, and which made a huge difference, because girls weren't staying at school beyond, 13, 14, 15. And she was able to stay on and be educated. And then, as luck would have it, our own Kate Edgar and her sister Lillian were the headmistress and senior mistress at Nelson Girls.
And for those who don't know Kate Edgar, if they might be listening from somewhere else, she was important. Why?
Well, Kate Edgar was the first woman in New Zealand, and I think the second in the British Commonwealth, to obtain a tertiary degree.
She got a Bachelor of Arts, didn't she?
Yes, she got a Bachelor of Arts. So she had a very powerful drive to mentor and get other young women to be educated to tertiary level. So there are a few girls in Nelson Girls that she then mentored, academically mentored, and they had in a special class, and further scholarships kept them in the school. So that they could do a university degree, because they were affiliated through the University of New Zealand. Because young women like Jessie from poor homes couldn't, like Ernest Rutherford got another scholarship and went off to Canterbury University, but there's no way somebody like Jessie, as a young woman, could go unaccompanied and go off to Canterbury College and do her degree.
Oh, so she did a university degree at the college,
at
Nelson Girls?
Yes, okay. They were endorsed by the University of New Zealand to actually be able, because of, Kate Edgar and Lillian Edgar, who also had a MA, they could then teach these few students. So they were kind of like the creme de la creme of the school and the great pride of the school.
And of the country, probably. I mean, there wouldn't have been many other women educated
there
at that level.
Weren't a lot. There was just little pockets of them. And so she, at 19, got her BA. And then she went teaching, because, there wasn't really any other options for, an intellectual educated woman then. And so she then became a teacher, and that's how she ended up finally at Wanganui Girls College. So she was really important in that early educational history for New Zealand, and then I took months and months, but I tracked her down and found her living relatives who knew, and one of them's actually named Jessie after her because they know that she was an early person in New Zealand, woman in New Zealand who got a degree, but they had no idea about
about the netball.
No, because it's just a small part of who she is and what she did, and I've met them all on Zoom, and it's actually very emotional type of research because we just it's a really strange situation where I know more about their relative than they do. And,
yes.
And so I'm always really careful about sort of how I give that information to begin with and say this may sound a bit stalky and a bit weird.
Like an episode of Who Do You Think You Are or something like that.
Well, yes, it is. Oh, yes, I guess it is on that level. And, did you know that? And here is the evidence for. And so what I'm trying to do is to actually sort of give them the history of their relative, but also place them in a wider historical, social context and cultural context within New Zealand history and New Zealand women's history, and just say, yes, they had quite little lives. It didn't seem to be that much, but actually this is what they represent, and none of this has ever been documented or
You're
recognised.
the original researcher of this, aren't you? There's no one else who's done this.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yes.
Yes, you are.
Yeah. And I've done that for a number of different, women through from early netball and the formation of the association. So, but Jessie was obviously really early, and she's part of a very big European pioneering family. That there are a lot of naps one way or another, particularly still around in the Nelson area. So, and because she never married, she had no direct descendants, but she was very close to her sisters and some nieces and nephews. So there's a very lovely link coming through the family.
The thing that interested me as well about your netball study was what a difference it made in women's lives. That's another thing that I hadn't thought about. I played netball as a child very poorly, I must say, and then hadn't sort of thought about it since. But you were making some really important points, I think, about, for example, what they wore. They went from those long outfits, which would have been very cumbersome and hot, to a whole different look, didn't they, sometime around, I don't know when. And it was just a space for women, organised by women, about women, which was so rare because, sport was about men.
Yes, it was, and very limited as to where women were allowed to go and, what they were allowed to wear. So you've seen all of those early photos of women playing golf and croquet and even cycling, early on. They had a lot of clothing, but they still managed, I have to say. And those are changes in the times, obviously, as women were allowed to actually wear less and the hemlines came up and the clothing got a bit lighter and a bit more user-friendly. And, of course, the loss of the loss of the corset, which was fundamental in women being able to exercise properly. And, middle-class women,
because it constricted the lungs, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And working-class women didn't have to wear that sort of nonsense, but, they were busy working. But middle-class women, young women, were, who had to look good to get ready for marriage, it really shaped their bodies and to detriment of their health often. So that freeing up was, really important for them. And so, yes, the clothing changed enormously. Like if you think the change in clothing through the looser fitted of the 1920s,
And then the tunic, wasn't it? It was a
very, very liberating
woolen tunic.
Yes, the pleated serge tunic was, a great liberating garment because it fitted all shapes and sizes wasn't flattering, but it did fit all shapes and sizes, and it meant that they had free range of use of movement, so it made it. We all wore them, we hated them, but if we had to wear what was there before.
So we're now at 100 years of netball in this country, which is now used to be called the Basketball Association. What has that meant, do you think, for women in general? What has that whole organisation been in this country?
Well, netball's been in the country longer than 100 years, but the 100 years, the centenary, is to mark the foundation in 1924 of the New Zealand Basketball Association, which is the forerunner of Netball New Zealand. So what was important about that is that this group of women, three particularly important women, Myrtle Muir and Irene McInnes and Betty Armstrong, came together as representatives, regional representatives, and formed the NZBA, which is the Basketball Association. And it was based on the absolute fervent belief that they wanted to create recreational opportunity for young women, because there was a lot of basketball being played in the schools, in primary school particularly level, but for young adult women between leaving school and getting married. They had this period of time where they wanted their lives to be full and energetic and have options.
And free.
and options for them that gave them a rich recreational life. And they fervently believed that this game was the one that gave them that, because it was accessible and it was, easy to be able to play every weekend, and they had access to space that wasn't required for men's or young boys' sport, which was tennis courts in the middle of winter. So therefore they had this absolute fervent belief that this was the game that was going to liberate young adult women to enjoy themselves, and utterly fundamental to this was their belief in the importance of women's friendship. That esprit de corps, which is why the rules of the game are as they are. That's why in netball, and still in netball, you can't hang on to the ball for more than 3 seconds, because you can only win if your team all works together. One person cannot be the star.
Unlike basketball, actually.
Yes. So, and so that whole friendship, ongoing friendships and esprit de corps, was absolutely fundamental to the rules of the game and what they believed would sustain young women and and enrich their lives.
And they're right, aren't they?
Well,
happened.
They did achieve that. That's really what did happen. Whether we're going to have another 100 years is a moot point. I very much doubt it, actually. But for this, past 100 plus years, it certainly has been a game. And the modern research that we do, which is also part of the Marsden, which is fan research and the overall Marsden.
State of the game at the moment.
Yes. Well, no, it's we're interviewing women and generations of women about the significance of netball intergenerationally within their lives and within their whānau. So that is the other part of the research. And we've already done sort of 300, 400 interviews where we just, do these, what we call our roving chats, and we talk to women and we do longer interviews as well. And fundamental to, what they all get out of netball is, yes, there's the game and there's the fitness and all of that, but it is the friendships, it's the ongoing friendships that for them is incredibly important. And for many whānau, it is that this is the game our family play. This is what we all play. I play with my aunties, well, my aunties always come, or, my mum plays, I play. My mum coaches the team, my mum washes the bibs, it's all. And I'm not saying this is exclusive to netball, but it has been fundamental to what has been the dominant game for over a century.
And that leaves us with just a bit of a plug for the Auckland Museum exhibition, which is on at the moment, and it's called
Our Game. And it's looking at the over 100 years of netball, and we have gathered artefacts, moving images, visual images. We've got the original minute book from the formation of the NZBA in 1924. We've got Myrtle Muir's whistle. She was the manager of the very first Silver Ferns netball team that played Australia and lost in 1938. So we have just these really carefully chosen artefacts. We've had a basket that was used as a goal, woven by a New Zealand basket weaver to replicate that 1906 goal. And so it's just, obviously it's not the whole history of the last 100 plus years, but it is just these little pieces where you can dip in and out of that history. And we've also profiled some of the really key movers and shakers within that, with their little profiles of them, and as well as the artefacts.
So in case you missed it, the exhibition is at the Auckland Museum. It's called Our Game, A Century of Netball in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And Margaret, you're going to be up there from time to time talking to people about it, aren't you?
Yes, and particularly if there's school groups but who I really want to be able to connect with are women who played back in the day when we played the old 9-a-side game in New Zealand, and have memories of, I talked to somebody a couple of weeks ago who played in the mud on Hagley Park in the 1950s, the 9-a-side game. She said, we didn't run, we slid in the Christchurch winter. So to talk about, those sort of memories about the early game, which have never been recorded.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much for coming in. Ngā mihi nui.
Kia ora, thank you.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts by following us on social media.